Most people's life stories are lost forever, but yours doesn't have to be. Good evening. Tonight is our third series of life story interviews, and I'm fortunate enough to have George Brown to interview tonight. First, George, tell me a little bit about where you were born and what your early life was like.
Okay. Well, I was born in Plattsburgh, New York, which is in upstate New York, northern New York actually, on Lake Champlain, across the lake from Burlington, Vermont, and a little bit further north. Actually, the biggest city close to there is Montreal, Canada. And I've been to Montreal many times, and I remember during World War II, when I was a very small child, we used to go up to Canada, not necessarily as far as Montreal, but across the border anyway, to get things that we couldn't get in Plattsburgh during the war, like meat and eggs and butter and things like that. So I had an introduction to Canada early on in my life. Yeah.
Did you speak French? They speak French a lot in Montreal.
Right. I didn't speak French myself at that point, but my mother still spoke French. As I'll say a little bit later when we talk about one of my hobbies, I'm all French-Canadian genealogy. I didn't learn it until I was in high school, but my mother still spoke French. In fact, there's a funny story of we were going up there. This was a little bit later. I must have been about maybe 4 or 5, and my sister Claire was 3 years older. And we had gone up with my father and mother to buy some food and stuff. And we stopped, and my mother got out of the car and went in because she was the one that spoke French. And normally it wouldn't take too long, but this particular time it took an awful long time for her to come out. And my father turned around and finally said to my sister and me, why don't you go up and see what's wrong with her, what's happening, you know. So we walked in, and she was waiting in line. There was just a long line of customers at the checkout counter. So we ran up to her, and of course we're babbling away in English. And when we got to the clerk looked down at us, and then my mother started to speak French. And the clerk said, "Oh, how wonderful, your children speak perfect English." Because she thought we were all Canadians.
What a cute
We fooled
story.
her.
How cute.
No.
And so speaking of sisters, how many were in your family and what?
Well, I have 2 sisters, both deceased now, but that both lived quite some time. My older sister, Carol, was 17 years older than me, and she died in 2001.
From the same parents? Was
Yep.
she? Oh, okay.
And she was the first, I was the last, see.
Uh-huh.
And then I had another sister, Claire, who was 3 years older than me and died about 6 or 7 years ago. But in between each of them, and then between the younger sister and myself, there were 2 boys that died at birth.
That happened a lot in older times.
It certainly did. It was not an unusual event in those days.
Which was one thing I was going to ask you, I had on my agenda to ask, is I know you were growing up in that rural area. How different do you think life is today compared to then? I mean, what are some of the differences that people might like to hear about?
100% different. Plattsburgh is a city, but it's, at the time that I was growing up, there was about 25,000 people. And it was pretty homogeneous. There were, the original settlers in the late 1700s were French Canadians. And then in the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, there was an influx of Irish people. And that was basically it. Until World War II, when the Strategic Air Command base in Plattsburgh moved in, and then they got people from all over the country. So, and then a lot of those people settled there after the war. So it's a lot different demographically than it was when I was a child.
How did you end up in this area, and what So what was some of your educational background? What brought you here?
Well, I studied I went to a private high school up in Maine and then came down to the Boston area for college and for graduate school. My first graduate degree was in music at Catholic University in Washington, D.C.
Oh, really?
I got a master's in composition and theory. Can't say I've used it very much in terms of composition, but I did use it considerably because I wound up working at radio station WCRB FM.
Oh.
That at that point was in Waltham. It's been sold and it now belongs to WGBH in Boston.
Uh-huh.
But it was Boston's only commercial classical music station. And I was hired there as a librarian and eventually music director, where I stayed for 18 years.
Wow.
I used to tell people if they listened to the station and they liked what they heard, I was the one that chose the music. But if they didn't like what they heard, I just supervised. The reality was a little bit in between. I did maybe half to 2/3 of the programming I chose, and the rest of it was chosen by different announcers. I was rarely on the air, however. I was mostly behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But I really enjoyed the years that I was there, and the background in music obviously was quite helpful in working there and doing the job.
Now, through working there, did you were you able to make many trips involved? Did they at that time? In the past, I know companies used to allow people to have lots of chances to travel.
Right. I often would go off to represent the station at different events. Like the Metropolitan Opera in those days would always come to Boston on tour,
Mm-hmm.
and I would always go to the Heinz Auditorium in those days for the Metropolitan broadcasts, or not broadcasts, but productions. And I represented WCRB. There were other events that I did so. And one in particular that I remember was the first Madeira Bach Festival on the island of Madeira off the coast of Africa.
Really?
Madeira is really a province of Portugal. So even though it's, I don't know, several hundred miles from Portugal, it's considered domestic. And the year that I went, that first year, it was a week or 10-day long festival. We flew from New York on the Portuguese airline TAP to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon to Madeira. And in the time that I was on Madeira, TAP International went on strike. So when the festival was finished, we had no problem. We got back to Lisbon, and then we were stranded there for a day. I had dinner one evening in, I can't remember the name now of the hotel, but it's a hotel where Winston Churchill used to stay when he would go on vacation. Obviously, he wasn't there when I was there, however.
Oh, right. How exciting, yeah. And what about other trips? I know that you have a great interest in opera, and later I wanted you to at least tell about the place in upstate New York that you'd mentioned to me, that you go to give a plug for that.
Yeah,
for people who'll be watching the show.
As I say, I went to the Metropolitan Opera when it came to Boston for the first few years that I was at WCRB. And then the Heinz Auditorium is not a very good venue for opera. It's very hard to project the voice and to hear, and the balance of sound and so on. So I decided I would go down to New York, and wound up going to New York 10 opera a year for about 10 years. So I saw close to 100 productions at the Met over a 10-year period. And that was wonderful. The very first year that I went, we had a production of Ponchielli's opera La Gioconda.
Mm-hmm.
And Placido Domingo was singing the title role. And after the first act, he didn't come out for a bow, which should have indicated to us that there was something wrong with the... And we had a rather extended intermission before the second act. And when we were seated in our our seats for the second act, the lights went down, and then a voice came over the loudspeaker and said, "Mr. Domingo is withdrawing from this evening's performance because of vocal difficulties." He's having a cough or something.
Uh-huh.
And everybody in the theater went, "Oh," you know, moaning and groaning. And they said, "The performance, however, will continue. We've engaged tenor Carlo Bini to take the role."
Oh, I've
And
heard
everyone
of
said, "Who? Never heard of him, you know."
I've heard
So
of him now. But
he came out, and he wasn't a bad tenor, but he was no Domingo. And he obviously knew the music very well, but he didn't know the staging of it. So he
bumbled around. Yeah.
fumbled around a little bit, and the audience was just terrible. They booed and hissed, and they started throwing
Really?
their programs. Oh, and it got worse from act to act. And in the last act, the voice came out just before the act and said, "The conductor Giuseppe Patane has withdrawn on the advice of his doctor." And James Conlon, who was a very new young conductor at the Met then, will complete the opera this evening. At the end of the season, they handed out in our program a sort of evaluation of the year, which I thought, oh, isn't this nice? And I assumed they did that every year. That's the only year they did it. So I think they were trying to see what damage had been done with the l'affaire Carlo Bini.
You would think that opera people would be more sophisticated than throwing their...
Oh, no. The New York Times the next day had the whole story. They said, "Domingo has never pulled out of an opera mid-opera. If he's not feeling well, he lets the management know well in advance, and they can get a replacement." This time they didn't, and they didn't have a backup.
Oh.
So they looked out in the audience, and they saw Carlo Bini, who was scheduled to take the role several weeks later after Domingo would be through. And they went to him and said, "You've got to come in, you've got to step in because Domingo is leaving." And he said, "I just had a full meal, my voice is not, I haven't readied my voice, and I don't know the staging." And they said, "Don't worry, the audience will understand."
How wrong they were. What
So
a fascinating
the
story.
reviewer said at the end, he said, "This rarely happens at the Met, but it happens all the time in Europe, particularly in Italy. In Milan, they throw tomatoes and vegetables of all kinds if they don't like the singer." And
Oh, really? I wasn't aware of that. That's
Yeah,
an interesting story. We have a lot of people that live here in Milford that are of Italian descent. Maybe they're aware of that. I've never heard of that. So in addition to that, I think we only were at where you're, for your past history at CRB. So what else have you?
Well, I was there for 18 years,
Uh-huh.
and then I got downsized. They had to cut back a little bit, so I left, and almost immediately found another job. And earlier, I had gotten another master's degree in library science from Simmons College. So when I left the radio station, I got a job at the Shrewsbury Public Library, first as reference librarian, and about a year or so later, I moved up to head of adult services and eventually assistant director. And actually in around 2005, 6, somewhere around in there, the then director of the library, Bonnie O'Brien, retired, and I became acting director for 5 months while they did a search for a new director, and then hired the present library director, Ellen Dolan. And during that 5-month period was the window of opportunity to make a proposal to get funding from the state to build a new library in Shrewsbury. So that process has taken about 10 years now, and we're now about, I think in beginning of November is groundbreaking for the new library.
Oh, well, that was exciting that you had a chance to help
That's right.
go through that process.
That's right. In January of this year, I retired after 20 years at the library, but I still have an investment in seeing that library get built.
Oh, great.
So I'm thrilled that it has gone through. I'm sorry that it took as long as it did, but I'm thrilled that it's going through, and in a couple of years it will be built and open, and then everybody can enjoy it.
Oh, wonderful. You retired. Did they give you any particular accommodations?
Oh my! It was very embarrassing. They, Ellen Dolan, the director, said the following Sunday. So it was, remember what the date is, but the first Sunday in February. She said, in the afternoon we'd like to have a little reception for you. I said, well, okay. Well, there were quite a few people from town, and even some people from out of town, that used the library that showed up for this reception. And they gave me all kinds of presentations. There was the sort of usual thing that the state Senate and the state House, you know, because the representatives from Shrewsbury had gotten these. But the ones that I really appreciated were a plaque that came from the trustees of the library in appreciation of my years at the library, and also a similar proposal, or not proposal, but a plaque of some kind from the selectmen in town.
Okay, I hope we can, we'll insert those in the show so
Sure.
that people can see those.
But the really thrilling thing to me, which I thought only happened in the movies, is they gave me a gold watch.
Really?
Yep.
Oh.
And it says, in appreciation for 20 years of library service from your library staff family.
Is that the watch?
No, it's a gold, it's a pocket watch. But
Oh, it's a
I have
pocket
brought
watch.
it, and we'll show it to.
Oh, okay, we
people.
can put it on the program.
Mhm.
Good. And so, what are you enjoying now as in your retirement years? Since
Well,
it's been-
something that I started back almost maybe a year or two after I went to the Shrewsbury Library, I got interested in genealogy and family history.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back to Plattsburgh with my older sister Carol, actually. And we went to the cemetery and we took down all the information that was on the tombstones. And then I went to the church and I got all kinds of information from the church records. And then I came home and started to enter it into the computer.
Mm-hmm.
Realized that I had missed a lot of things that had I had it all computerized to begin with, I could have known. So I went a few years later, I went back and filled things in. But I have managed to trace my 4 grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Yes, the 4 grandfathers were all born in Canada and came down to the United States in the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 of the grandmothers similarly. The 4th grandmother, my father's mother, was born in Montreal and emigrated to Plattsburgh around the late 1800s. So she's only 2 generations back, but the
Mm-hmm.
others are like 3 and 4 generations back. But I managed to trace all 4 of the grandparent couples back to 3 of them back to different places in France in the late 1600s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them, my father's father, the Brown, which would have been Le Brun, back to
How
Brussels.
was that? How did you pronounce that?
Le Brun,
Le Brun. Okay.
which is brown in
Brown.
French.
Yeah.
Trace that back to Brussels, Belgium in the late 1600s. And that's the one that intrigues me the most, because what I did find in the archives in Quebec was a notation that he was a lawyer and a deputy on the Upper Imperial Council of the city of Brussels. This would have been, I don't know, 1680, 1690, something like that.
Wow.
Now, Belgium was not a separate country until about 1820 or so.
So that was France?
So it was, well, No, it was French speaking, the Brussels part, but it flip-flopped for several centuries between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs.
Oh, really?
It was during the French Revolution that the French came in and took it over for a few decades, and then it became independent. But my question that I asked myself is why would, well, this gentleman who was a lawyer never came to Canada, but his son did. And my question is, why would he have come to Canada? Even in those days, being a lawyer had to be a fairly cushy job. And yet the son would have come to Canada. First of all, it would have been on a very rickety boat for probably a month of across the ocean. And then in Canada in the mid to late 1600s was still pretty primitive. He would have had to cut down trees and build his own log cabin, plant his own vegetable and fruit garden, and kill his own meat products, and fight off the Indians while he was also raising a family. Anything but a cushy.
Now, did he bring the family?
No, he married in Canada.
He married in Canada.
And all of his children were born in Canada.
So how would you be able to locate that, find out what was his reason for coming?
I've been even to Brussels, Belgium, to look in the archives to see what I could get, but I couldn't find anything there.
That is a fascinating story.
Everybody that does genealogy has brick walls, as we call them.
They run into?
And you have to, that's what you work on. You try to find out ways of getting around it or over it or behind it somehow, and then carry on after that. So that's one of my brick walls that I am working on.
And were you telling me earlier that you have other people from your ancestry that were...
Yes. Now, a little bit of Canadian history. The British came to New England in 1620, and those people that came, for the most part, were people that said goodbye to Britain. This is going to be home. So within less than a generation, they had already set up towns and printing presses and stores, and they were really on their way to becoming a total nation themselves here. The French came to Canada about 10 years later in the 1630s. But their idea was they were going to come here. It was just the men that came, and they were going to catch lots of beaver and other furs that they could then take home to Canada, to France.
Up to France,
Well, most of them wound up staying in Canada, but it took them a couple of generations to realize that home was now here instead of across the ocean. So they were a little bit slower in catching up on that kind of thing. So in the 1650s and 60s, I believe, the king at the time, Louis XIV, decided that if they were going to be settling in Canada permanently, they needed some French women. So he sent over several shiploads of women.
Really?
He paid their dowry, and he gave them a little bit of money to start them off, and they were known as daughters of the king, filles du roi. So they're sort of the equivalent of Mayflower people for the English, except that the Mayflower was just one shipload, whereas there's I don't know, there's over 100 daughters of the king. Well, I have traced one of my ancestors back to a daughter of the king, which is not really unusual for French Canadians. Practically every French Canadian has at least one of these daughters of the king in their genealogy.
What a fascinating story. That's great. And you said that you're still involved with the genealogy. Have you set up groups for that or anything?
Yeah, after I started myself, and I didn't know anything, I was starting from scratch. So I learned by doing. And after a couple of years, I thought, I was a librarian there. I thought, well, I think I've learned enough that I could help other people to get started. So I put together an introductory class and advertised it. and thought, well, I might get 10 or 15 people that might be interested. I got almost 40 people that showed up.
Wow.
So I did the class, and I got some feedback, and a couple of years later I did the class a second time, and I had learned a lot more myself in those 2 years, and I got another 30 people or so. I said, wow. So I said at the end of the session, I said, would any of you be interested in some kind of ongoing type of thing here, perhaps a genealogy club? And practically all of them raised their hand and said, yes, yes. So we created the Shrewsbury Genealogy Club, which continues to meet monthly.
Now, do you have to, excuse me for interrupting.
Presently, it's on the fourth Monday of the month.
Okay.
And anybody can come. There are no dues, no further responsibilities other than just showing up and contributing.
And it's at the Shrewsbury Library?
Mm-hmm. That's at the Shrewsbury Library.
On the fourth Monday.
Yep.
Okay, that would be interesting. Maybe some people who are watching the show would find that interesting. I know I would. I know you've done creative writing.
Well, my older sister Carol, had started a writers group when she moved to Framingham many, many years ago. But she was living in a small condo, and so she used my dining room because I wasn't there in the evening, and said, fine, go ahead and meet there. Well, when she passed away in 2001, the members of the group were a little reluctant to just use my dining room without any kind of connection to me. So I said, okay, I'll join the writers group, and have been part of it ever since then. And that's where I met you.
Right, that's what I was going to say, yes. And I met your sister Carol, that's how I got. In fact, I remember we used to meet at a Wendy's on Route 135. That's how we got started. So I started with her, and I've been honored to be a part of that group ever since. And I loved Carol. I loved what she used to help all of us budding writers. I don't write much anymore, but I still enjoy the group.
Yeah. She was a very serious writer. She took that writers group very seriously. We're a little more casual about it now.
Right.
But we do occasionally write something
and,
and talk about writing and
discuss interesting topics, which I find fascinating. One other thing I wanted to ask you was, with the current lifestyle and the way things are going, with the things going on in the Middle East and all of that, if you had any ideas about what maybe we might do to improve things.
Oh boy.
I know that's a tough question, but it's been on my mind since.
It is. Well, I guess all I can say is somebody other than myself has said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think that what's going on in the Middle East is insanity. Everybody keeps doing the same thing they've always been doing, and it doesn't resolve anything, it just makes it worse. So I think we need somebody that's going to look at the whole thing from a different perspective and say, we need to be doing something that we've never done before. Instead of all the wars between all of the Arab states and Israel, I like to remind myself that the only 2 times that Israel has negotiated peace treaties was with Egypt and with Jordan decades ago, and those really are still standing. They're still in effect. So that's something maybe we need to do more diplomatic stuff rather than less war making.
I think I agree with you. I just like to I like to bring that up towards the end. So in closing tonight, this has been our 3rd interview. Thank you. Stay tuned for other interviews.